What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and today there's not really going to be a modern deck tech, just because we kind of went over the heavy hitters of the modern format. We're actually going to be getting into more of a discussion-y type video for modern, and probably the best one to start with is by this giant trader, Demonic Tutors, who, if you know him or you watch his stream and stuff like that, in modern, there's been like a few times where I've seen him play like kind of memey, like modern decks and stuff like that. But usually known for playing Yawgmoth, the Black Green Yawgmoth deck, which we have a deck tech over and sort of kind of like an in depth review of it. If you want to check that out, you're more than welcome to. I believe it's like maybe a month or two old. The deck really hasn't innovated too much past that, but you are free to watch that deck tech, of course, after watching this. So instead of actually going over the elementals deck, because we do have a video on it. We call it the four color money pile because it is almost $2 grand, and you need a loan to be able to afford to even play this deck. And you probably need to play with a triple sleeved, and you're also playing an 8 card deck because of Yorion. So really, it's the video that I wanted to create today, and like I wanted to talk about is essentially elementals and the almost the toxicity of it existing in the format, and why I think overall it's could possibly lead to a banning. Spoiler, I'm not sure what though. So kind of to go through it really quickly. Essentially, four color elementals or like the elementals deck is essentially just a giant pile of good creatures with uh, really good ETBs and probably some of the best like spells in the format. So um, as we kind of went over, like when we talked about like essentially why humans isn't played and why most of the time like decks like this would kind of get beat by like burn or like super aggressive aggro decks. Fury and Solitude are a heck of a magic card. The fact that Solitude is essentially like swords on a body, and on a 3/2 lifelink body, no less, like they can be really easy to cast once you kind of like ramp up into like all your spells and things like that. And Fury also just like blunting that aggression where it can kill, obviously up to four creatures, but a lot of times killing like one or two good sized creatures and just having that flexibility of doing so does blunt a lot of offense because even if Fury's like a 2 for 2, it's a 2 for 2 in your favor. It's only bad when it's like a 2 for 1 in your opponent's favor. But normally, if you're like 2 for 1ing yourself with a Fury, you're probably still coming ahead in that transaction, unless your opponent just has like the exact thing that you just killed to like come back with. So with cards like Fury and Solitude, playing this deck is feels free in a way. Where it's like obviously it does take a lot of skill. There's sequencing. You have to play up to a certain speed, and if you lose game one and you're a slow player, chances are you could just end up losing the match entirely. But this deck has such a hard time, I think, losing game one when you know exactly how to sequence things properly and things to keep an eye out for and stuff like that. So if you look at it like for Risen Wreath, for Omnath, apparently pronouncing is very hard for me today. Icefang Quaddle, all of these cards just have really good enter the battlefield abilities. Obviously, Icefang, Omnath, drawing cards. Risen Reef essentially draws a card or ramps, and if you have multiple elementals, a la Omnath, Furies, Solitudes, things like that, then you just kind of get to go off. Charmaw, I'm not exactly sure why Tutors is playing Charmaw in this deck in particular. If he was just worried about like Tron or things like that. But the fact that this also, I mean, you could play this thing on like turn 3 or turn 4, and just blowing up a non-basic land is pretty good, especially like a way to mess with the mirror where you can kind of like hit their colors and stuff. Titania is also really gross because it'll get you like more landfall triggers for like Omnath, and then obviously fetch lands that you pick up with like Ren and Six and stuff. Just make 5/3s that could also trigger Risen Reef and kind of end the game and stuff. So taking all this into account, like before we even get to really any of the other spells, like obviously Ephemerate is a house when you can just like evoke a Fury or Solitude, ephemerate it, and get to keep it, and then also just deal with two things if you're Solitude, and then dealing with more than two things, probably up to like eight things technically with Fury. Um, just like the ceiling on like Ephemerate is huge, and then like the floor, is that it blinks a Coatl and draws, and it essentially like replaces itself twice, which is very good. Lightning Bolt, Prismatic Ending, Unholy Heat, Eldrami's Call. Obviously, getting to just to find like your two one ofs in Obsidian Charm Titania, and then getting like Furies and Solitudes and stuff like that. Just all very very good cards. The mana base is nauseating to say the least, and the sideboard also really gross. So now that we kind of went over the deck really quickly, I mean, it should be pretty self-explanatory. And I think I've even said it a few times, like why this deck is good. The fact that it can support this kind of mana base, it gets to play all of these cards, and essentially just always seem to have like perfect mana with like fetch lands and triomes. Obviously, and getting to play like abundant growth and in a way like Oath of Nissa to be able to like dig for the majority of like its spells and the majority of its deck, because I believe it's like these 15 spells. So I mean, you have 65 cards that are hits with, or 64 cards I guess, with Oath of Nissa, some number of them, and then also just not even have to worry about like being able to cast like your spells and stuff, at least like the planeswalkers. Ren and 6 getting to buy back fetch lands that like trigger off Omnath, that can trigger like Titania, things like that. It's just this deck has like an insane engine, and this deck really kind of like puts the screws on you to like put pressure on it. But if it just draws like the right half of its deck, or if it finds like Eldrami's Call and it has a Fury, or has a red card in hand, whatever, some combination of that, you just kind of get forced out of the game, because then at that point you're trying to rebuild, and then this deck kind of just gets to have its way with you until it's ready to win the game. So really, like, what should happen to this deck, right? Because I feel like elementals, 4 color money pile, uh, 4 color just absolute complete bullshit. What the heck can we do essentially to like nerf this deck? And I think realistically, like honest to God, like one of the realistic things, and I, I firstly I want to go to like Solitude or Fury. You know, I didn't like banning Lurrus if you were not going to ban Yorion, for the fact that you leave only one playable companion in the format, and obviously you can play other companions. I believe Lutri is still legal. I think Lurrus is the only banned one. I don't know if it's Zerdra or whatever the red white one is. But the fact that like you leave Yorion in this format, and obviously Modern has decks that either can play the game really quickly. You have like Yawgmoth that plays to like an aggro deck but can combo. You have Blue Red Murktide that can play kind of like a tempo game, play a little bit of a control game if it needs to, and then obviously win with a giant Murktide. You have this deck that just could beat both decks pretty easily, and then just generates so much value that like you just bury other decks that aren't doing their thing the most optimal way. And even if like they do have like the most optimal draw, you still have plenty of outs to actually out those things. And it's outing decks and like beating decks that I don't think are I think that are pretty healthy. I think Elementals is pushing out decks that are healthy for the modern format. And I think the easy one to like look at is like you either ban like Omnath, or you ban like Fury or Solitude or whatever. But I think you probably start with Yorion if there is any ban, because if you're just not going to have companions be legal, or like every single companion be legal in the format, then I'm just fine with you banning all companions, and then either maybe revisiting the mechanic in like another set, or just companion being one of those things that like tried once, it was fun while it lasted, but just leave it on the shelf. So In my opinion, after going everything, just thinking about like the format and everything, I think getting rid of the reason to play 20 extra cards in your deck and just kind of be able to fit cards like Titania, Charmaw, possibly even like Ephemerates and Eldrami's Calls and stuff like that. You have to get rid of Yorion. I think you want to do it sooner rather than later because of all these decks and all these big events that are having elementals really just kind of like run the show. I mean, Tutors won the Modern Challenge, 7-0 on the 21st, and then the next day Elementals won the Modern Challenge. I mean, there was that time where like Yogg did it, but in terms of like what Yawgmoth does versus what Elementals does, Elementals is by far the most does the most honestly and is unfair where the Yawgmoth deck, like it's unfair that there is times where it could just kind of win out of nowhere, and it has some of these other like intricate combos. But you know, just kind of like the reason why like Sensei's Divining Top and like Counterbalance, like why that deck got banned, I feel like it's the same way like Elementals, except not only is the pace of play like possibly miserable for other players, but also just the fact that like this deck is insane. It's almost 2 grand. Modern's an expensive format, but like there's other decks that like just are hundreds of dollars, like plenty of hundreds of dollars behind that price tag. On top of that, also being like the only playable deck that like really gets a companion. Like Death Shadow gets like Jangotha, but I feel like that's kind of like a reach. That's just because you get to play an extra card. Where Yorion can be a win more, but really like takes a door that's like pretty wide open and just like firmly slams it so hard that it actually goes in the wrong way. So my advice, I would ban Yorion first. If not, then maybe I would look at like Fury and Solitude. Maybe lean more towards like Fury, just because to me that feels more unfair of the two. But who knows? I'm not even like 100% sure that that would even be correct, banning either of those. And I don't think Omnath like really sees much more play outside of this deck. That like maybe it's one of the cards that gets cut if you ban Yorion. I'm not sure. All I know is I'm glad that like I don't play this deck, but I also wish I was about like 2 grand richer so I could afford to play it. Because obviously it's very good if it won 2 modern challenges. So if you have this deck, definitely play it while it's still legal. Obviously, I'm not any insider or anything on like potential future bans, but they Wizards does like to kind of like control decks that control a large portion of like the metagame. And even though like Murktide is one of the most played decks, I think Elementals is easily by far the best deck to be playing in the modern format currently. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. I've rambled on long enough about why Elementals is terrible for the format and why it just needs to die and people need to play Risen Reef more fair. Let me know what you think in the comments about the deck in general. Maybe if you play it, maybe give it some insight onto, maybe how to play the deck. Where it would go maybe if Yorion got banned, things like that. So that's going to do it for me this video. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next video. And if you want to see more videos like this and stuff, I have plenty of other modern deck techs and other modern type videos. So now it'll do it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.